Saying the Contract and What It Cost. Chapter 1. A Wanderer, by Martha Finley. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Bria Snow. Lost, lost, lost. The sun had set amid angry clouds. Deep shadows already filled the recesses of the forest through which the iron horse went thundering on its way, while an icy wind, bringing with it frequent dashes of rain and sleet, swept through the leafless branches of the trees, tossing them wildly against a dull leaden sky. A lady, gazing out into the gathering gloom, started with a sudden exclamation of surprise and dismay. Her husband leaned hastily past her to see what had called it forth. Then, with a smile at his own folly in forgetting that at the rate of speed with which they were moving, the object, whatever it might be, was already out of sight, settled himself back again, bending a look of mild inquiry upon her agitated countenance. She shivered, and drawing her shawl more closely about her, put her lips to his ear, that she might be heard above the noise of the train. It was a face, John, a woman's face upturned to the sky, wan, distressed, wretched, with great sorrowful eyes. It just gleamed out upon me for an instant as we swept by, and was gone. Poor thing, she must be in sore trouble. He only shook his head with a smile of conscious superiority of wisdom. Don't let your imagination run away with you, my dear, nor waste your sympathy upon a wandering gipsy who would not exchange places with you if she could. The train was slackening in speed, and they could now converse with ease. She is no ordinary tramp, was the quick, earnest reply, and if ever bitter, hopeless grief and despair were written on a human face, they were on hers. I wish we could go back and find her. Quite impossible, Dolly, so let us talk of something more agreeable. We change cars soon, don't we? She asked. Worse than that. We get out at the next station and wait there 2 mortal hours for another train. Clearfield Station! Shouted the conductor, throwing open the car door. An acre or 2 of ground had been cleared of trees, though many of the stumps were still standing. There was no appearance of a town, only a depot and a few shanties scattered here and there, the whole hemmed in by the forest, except on the 2 sides where the road had cut its way through. The train stopped, and John and Dolly, otherwise Mr. and Mrs. Kemper, alighted, and the gentleman hurried his wife out of the rain and sleet into the depot. A very forlorn place it looked, with its rusty stove, filthy floor and windows, and hard straight-backed wooden chairs and settee, which gave small promise of rest or ease to the delayed and weary traveller. What a wretched hole! Said Mrs. Kemper, sending a rueful glance from side to side. How long did you say we'd have to stay here, John? 2 hours, Dolly. Here, take this chair by the fire, and I'll go and see what can be done. He came back presently, and pointing through the window, You see that light yonder, Dolly? He said. It comes from a shanty some 100 yards away, where they tell me we can at least find cleanliness and a cup of hot tea. There seems to be a lull in the storm at this moment, too. Shall we go and try it? By all means, she answered, rising with alacrity and taking his offered arm. I presume the walking is bad enough, but my boots are thick. Picking their way carefully between stumps and pools of water just visible in the deepening gloom, they reached the place. It was a long, low building of ruder structure, its walls rough boards nailed on horizontally, leaving large cracks between, with merely a covering of painted canvas upon the outside to keep wind and rain at bay. The gable end, with its one door and window, in which burned the lamp that had guided them, faced the road. Entering, our travellers found themselves in a small waiting room, very simply furnished, but invitingly warm, clean, and tidy. A neatly dressed young woman greeted them with a pleasant "Good evening," and throwing open an inner door, asked if they would walk out to supper. "I should prefer just taking something here," said Mrs. Kemper, shrinking back at the sight of a long table with only a number of rough-looking men about it. "Couldn't you bring me a cup of hot tea and whatever you have to eat?" "Yes, ma'am, of course." And the girl vanished, to return presently with the tea, a piece of steak, bread, butter, and hot corn cakes. Out in the forest a woman was battling with the storm, a woman with a child in her arms. A slight, willowy form was hers, once the perfection of grace in outline and movement, now bent and staggering with weakness; a face whose bright soft eyes, glowing cheeks, and ruby lips were not long ago the admiration or envy of many, though now wan and pinched with famine and wasting sickness. It was the same face that Mrs. Kemper had seen from the car window, upturned despairingly to the stormy sky for a moment as the weary wanderer paused and leaned against the tree by the roadside to gather strength and breath for renewed exertion. Both were well nigh spent, and hope so nearly dead within her that, but for the babe in her arms, she had laid down to die there in the lonely wood, with no human creature near to pity or console. But mother love was stronger than the love of life. She had taken the thin faded shawl from her own shoulders to wrap it about the little one, and so had kept it comparatively warm and dry, while she herself was drenched to the skin. Her limbs were almost benumbed with cold, and the cutting wind, as it dashed the rain and sleet full in her face, seemed piercing to her very vitals. Twilight was fast deepening into night. The way grew dark and slippery. Now her feet sank in the mud, and she struggled out only to slip into a pool of water, or to stumble and fall over a stump or log, or to catch and tear her clothing on some thorny bush. The pauses for breath grew more frequent, the steps, as she moved forward again, weaker and more tottering. The weary arms could scarce sustain the weight of the child, and she knew not how far distant was the nearest human habitation. She was about to give up in utter despair, when the gleam of a not very distant light, seen through the trees, inspired her with new hope and energy. She pressed forward, and presently emerged from the wood and found herself at Clearfield Station, with the light in the window of the shanty inn shining out ruddily not 100 yards away. She crept to the door and knocked faintly. Mr. Kemper, who had just finished his supper, rose and opened it. "Come in," he said. "This is a public house, and I presume no one will object," he added, catching sight of the ragged, dripping figure. She stepped in, staggered to the fire, and dropped down on the floor beside it. "Drunk," he muttered, with a gesture of disgust. "No, no, John, she is ill, starving perhaps, poor thing, poor thing!" cried his keener-sighted wife, springing forward, barely in time to catch the sleeping babe as the weary arms relaxed their hold, and the wanderer sank back against the wall in a state of semi-insensibility, her eyes closed, and not a trace of colour on cheek or lip. "She's dying!" exclaimed Mr. Kemper in a frightened whisper, and rushing to the inner door, "Somebody run for a doctor, quick! Here is a woman who seems to be very ill," he cried hurriedly. "None to be had within 3 or 4 miles," returned a gruff voice from the table. "What ails the woman? Who is she?" "I don't know, but something must be done." "Give her a cup of your tea, Irene," said the voice. "A few drops of brandy from the flask in our luncheon basket, John," said his wife. "I always take it along in case of sickness, you know." But the child, a girl of 18 months, woke with a cry, "Mamma, mamma!" and at the sound the mother's eyes unclosed. "Give her to me, my little Ethel," she said faintly. "You are ill, my good woman, not able to hold her," Mrs. Kemper said, as she reluctantly complied with the request. "Yes, and I have eaten nothing to-day, and have walked many miles." "Poor soul!" exclaimed Irene, the kind-hearted mistress of the shanty, coming in with the tea. "Here, drink this, and I'll bring you some supper. You look more dead than alive, and the rain has been soaking you through and through. Dear, dear, you'll catch your death of cold." She raised the wanderer's head as she spoke, and held the cup to her lips. It was eagerly drained to the last drop, and seemed to revive the poor creature greatly. Food was brought, and the babe devoured it as if half famished, but the mother ate sparingly. She was evidently very ill, almost dying, thought those about her, and hastened to do all in their power for her relief and comfort. Plainly she was, as Mrs. Kemper had said, no common tramp. There was a ladylike refinement in face, voice, and manner. Her accent was pure, her speech correct, and even elegant, as, in answer to kindly inquiries, she gave a brief account of the causes of her present sad condition. At an early age she had been left an orphan and without any natural protector, had married some 3 years ago, and 2 years later her husband had died, leaving her penniless, in feeble health, and with a babe to support. She had managed for a time to earn a scanty living by needlework, but there was little demand for it where she lived, and wages were very low, so, taking her child in her arms, she had set out in search of other employment or a better location. It had proved a long, weary quest, and here she was, in utter destitution, and about, she greatly feared, to die, and leave her helpless babe with none to love and care for it. With the last words a great sob burst from her bosom, and clasping the little creature close, "Ah, my darling, my little Ethel, if I might but take you with me!" she moaned in anguish. "Ah, now, don't take on so," Irene said kindly. "You'll be better to-morrow. Walking all day in the cold, and getting wet too, it's no wonder you're downhearted like. But cheer up, you'll get over it and find work, and maybe see as good days as ever you did." The wanderer thanked her with a grateful look, as she continued silently to caress Ethel, the child, no longer cold and hungry, hanging about her mother's neck, stroking her face lovingly, and prattling in innocent glee. Mrs. Kemper watched her with delighted, longing eyes, the tears starting to them once and again. "What a lovely, darling little creature she is," she whispered to her husband. "Just the age our Nellie was." And then she added a few words in a still lower tone. He nodded acquiescence, and turning to the mother, said that he and his wife would like to adopt the child and bring it up as their own, that they would do so if she would at once give it up entirely to them. A look of mingled grief and terror came over her face at the bare suggestion. She clutched her treasure in a death-like grasp. "No, no! How could I? How could I?" she cried. "My baby, my precious baby, my all! No, no! Never, never!" "Take time to consider," he said soothingly. "I am sorry to distress you, but as you yourself have said, your child will soon need another protector, and it is very unlikely that another will be readily found to do as well by her as we would." "But wait till I am gone," she moaned. "She is my all, my all! Oh, 'tis hard to die and leave her! My baby, my baby! Your mother's heart will break." And the tears fell like rain on the wondering little face upturned to hers. "Don't cry, Ethel's mamma. Ethel love oo," cooed the baby, lifting her dress to wipe away the tears, while with the other arm she clung about her neck, then kissing her wet cheek again and again. Mrs. Kemper, with great tears of sympathy rolling down her own cheeks, knelt at the wanderer's side, and taking one thin hand in hers, said, "I feel for you, my poor, poor friend. I do indeed. I know a mother's heart, for I once had a little one like this, and when death snatched her from me I would gladly have gone down into the grave with her, for she was my only one. That was 10 years ago. I have never had another, and it is not likely I ever shall. And now, when you feel that you must leave this darling, will you not let me have her to fill the vacant place in my heart, in our hearts and home? For my husband will love her dearly too, and be a good father to her." "Oh, gladly, when I am gone." "But we cannot wait. We must go on our journey in another hour. It will be to you only parting a little sooner, for her good too. You cannot be selfish where your dear child is concerned." "No, no, God knows I would suffer anything for her. I love her better than my own soul. But I cannot give her up till I must. Have pity, have pity. She is all I have left, parents, sister, husband, home, all, everything gone but her, my precious, precious baby. Oh, don't ask me to let her go from my arms while I live," she pleaded in heartbroken accents, with bitter sobs and tears. "We would not if it could not be helped," sobbed Mrs. Kemper, "but it cannot, and for her sake you will give us to her now?" Mr. Kemper joined his arguments and entreaties to those of his wife. They engaged to do all in their power for the well-being and happiness of the little one, treating her in every respect as if she were their own offspring, on the one condition that she should be given up entirely to them, never to be claimed by anyone, even a near relative or the mother herself, should she by any possibility survive. Mr. Kemper had torn a leaf from his notebook, and with pen and ink furnished by Irene had drawn up a deed of gift to that effect, which he was urging the mother to sign. "No, no, I can never, never agree to that," she cried out in reference to the last stipulation. "Live without my own precious child? Never, never!" "A mere form," he said. "You cannot live many days, my good woman. Do you not feel that it is so?" She but clasped her child closer, while her whole frame shook with the violence of her emotion. She seemed almost ready to expire with the mental anguish superadded to her great physical prostration. At length the distant rumble of an approaching train was heard. "There, you have but a moment left for decision," said the gentleman. "That is the train we must take. Will you sacrifice your child's welfare or your own feelings?" She was now seated beside the table, her child asleep in her arms. He laid the deed of gift he had made out before her as he spoke, and put a pen between her fingers. She lifted her eyes to his with a look of wild anguish fit to move a heart of stone. He simply pointed to the unconscious babe. She looked at it, seized the pen, hurriedly scrawled a name at the foot of the deed, and fell back fainting. But the shrill whistle of the locomotive and the thunder of the train close at hand aroused her. "We must go now. Let me take her," Mrs. Kemper was saying in tones tremulous with great compassion. "I will love her dearly, dearly. I will cherish her as the apple of my eye. Let me wrap this warm shawl around her." "No, Dolly, I'll carry her," Mr. Kemper said in a tone of half-suppressed delight, as he finished buttoning up his overcoat after safely depositing the notebook with the deed of gift in an inner pocket. But silently the mother put them both aside. There was agony in her wan, emaciated face. She could not speak for the choking in her throat, but she strained the child to her heart, laid her cold white cheek to its warm and rosy face, and kissed it passionately again and again. "We must go," repeated Mrs. Kemper. "Oh, my heart aches for you, but we must go." "We must indeed, poor thing. There is not a moment to be lost," added Mr. Kemper, taking the child from her with gentle force. "Here, this will supply your needs while you live, I think," putting a roll of notes into her hand. She dropped them as if a serpent had stung her, and with a wild cry rushed after him, as hastily wrapping a shawl about the infant he ran with it towards the train, his wife close behind him. They had already tarried almost too long, had scarcely time to gain the platform of the nearest car ere the train swept swiftly on its way. "My child! My child! Give me back my child!" shrieked the distracted mother, pursuing with outstretched arms, the storm beating pitilessly on her uncovered head, her long dark hair streaming in the wind. For a moment she seemed to fly over the ground, love and despair lending her unnatural strength and speed. The next, as the train was lost to sight in the depth of the forest, she tottered and would have fallen, but for the strong arm of a kindly switchman, who, hastily setting down his lantern, sprang forward just in time to save her. "She's in a dead faint, poor thing," he muttered to himself. "Here, Bill," to a comrade, "take a hold and help me to carry her into the depot." "Who is she, Jack, and what ails her?" asked Bill, hurrying up and holding his lantern high, while he peered curiously into the white, unconscious face. "No time to talk till we get her in out of the wet," returned Jack gruffly. They laid her down on the settee. "She's a human critter and in sore trouble, that's all I know," remarked Jack quietly, drawing his coat sleeve across his eyes as the two stood gazing upon the pitiful sight. End of Saying the Contract and What It Cost. Chapter 1. A Wanderer, by Martha Finley.